Hi, story nerds. It's Kelly Forden. I have a brand new way for us to work together. Starting this month, I'm offering a craft report card right here on the show. If you want professional feedback on your short story, here is your 3-step mission. Join our paid subscriber community at letsdeconstructastory.substack.com. Leave a review for the show on Apple Podcasts. Email me your draft up to 15 pages at kforden450@gmail.com and let me know if you would like me to review it anonymously or share your name with our listeners. I'll be picking one story each month to deconstruct live on the air. I cannot wait to read your work. Welcome, everyone. So happy to see you and so excited to talk about The Queen of Bad Influences by Jim Shepard. Jim Shepard has written 8 novels, including The Book of Aaron, which won the Sophie Brody Medal for Jewish Literature, the Penn New England Award for Fiction, the Ribolo Prize for Fiction, and the Clark Fiction Prize, as well as 6 short story collections, including Like You'd Understand Anyway, a finalist for the National Book Award and the Story Prize winner, and the forthcoming The Queen of Bad Influences. 8 of his stories have been chosen for the Best American Short Stories, 2 for the Penn O. Henry Prize Stories, and 3 for Pushcart Prizes. He's been a recipient of the Rhea Award for the short story, the Alex Award for Fiction, the Library of Congress Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. For 7 years, he was a columnist on film for the magazine The Believer, and his film essays have been collected in The Tunnel at the End of the Light. He's also written screenplays for 2 films made from his fiction, And Then I Go, 2017, and The World to Come, 2020. He lives in Williamstown with his wife, Karen Shepard, and 2 beagles. Awesome. And from 1983 to 2024, taught film and creative writing at Williams College. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Kelly. I think we're pretty much out of time after that intro.
I know. It's very impressive. I don't know if you know this, but Susan Shepard recommended that I look up your stories.
I think Susan did tell me that, yeah, so I have her to thank for this lash-up.
Yeah. Well, I love the story, and actually I wanted to start with a question that didn't make it to my list of questions, but I'm really interested in what it's like to write historical fiction in a short story and the research that goes into that for you.
There are a couple of central appeals for me for historical fiction. One is it's a way of getting at really important central emotional issues that I have without feeling like I'm getting at really important central emotional issues. Like most men, I'm not dying to sit down at a desk and confront my own knotty emotional problems. But what I can do is sort of channel my inner 10-year-old and say, wow, I'm really interested in what happened when the Lusitania sank, or I'm really interested in what young women in pre-Edwardian England faced in terms of the forces that made them conform. And then I have to interrogate where that interest is coming from, right? Some of it is just basic readerly interest that anybody would have, like this is a good story. But some of it, too, is that there's a key overlap there with my own concerns that's snagging my attention. And that distinction is the same distinction I would make when, you sit with a group of people and somebody says, oh, can you believe that thing that's going on in Asia right now? And you say, yeah, it's amazing. And you never think about it again. And then somebody else says, how about that thing in Florida? And you say, yeah, no, I haven't stopped thinking about that. I keep coming back to that. And I think the latter is evidence that it snags something that's concerning you as well. And so what I'm doing is very often reading around in all sorts of wildly arcane and obscure ways. At one point, I was checking a big pile of books out of the science library here at Williams, and the science librarian said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "What do you do?" Because it seemed to her that every time I check books out, they were on a radically different subject, essentially. But I feel like on the one hand, that has the advantage of making me a more interesting person. But on the other hand, it's a nice way of sort of getting my psyche out into the world and allowing myself to, while I'm learning something, start to nudge those areas that I want to deal with in terms of my own emotional issues. And very quickly, when I start to snag on something, I'll think, okay, if you wanna write about this, you need to learn more about the kind of emotional concerns that these people were facing and how they were both similar to yours and different than yours, you know?
So, why did you pick the Lusitania? I'm curious about that.
Well, I've been drawn to as a person, I've been drawn to catastrophe my whole life as a subject,
Mhm.
and so part of what's fascinating me about that is what any 10-year-old would be drawn to, right, which is the sort of spectacle of it. But part of it too is that I'm really interested in fiction that in some ways puts pressure on a character's conflict. We often run into conflicts in fiction where there isn't a whole lot of pressure put on it and it feels sort of unsatisfying, at least to me, right? It's like, well, Kelly gets along with her dad, but her dad also drives her crazy. This is a story about a trip where her dad didn't go along. And you're like, well, what's the point of that? Right? What you want is a trip where Kelly and her dad are trapped in the Volkswagen for 4 straight days, right? And then see what happens. Catastrophe has a way of putting the maximum pressure on a character's situation, not only in dramatic terms, but in emotional terms. And so I'm drawn to it for that reason. I'm also drawn to it for one of the thematic things that's on display in this story, and that is the way in which the world so often brings us up short in terms of our own sense of how much time we have to work out our issues. You know, you tend to think, I've got this really knotty problem with my friend. At some point, I'm going to have to deal with this, you know, but I don't have to deal with it right away. And the world so often just brings us up short and says, no, you ran out of time, essentially. And certainly that's what happens in my mind to Constance, right? She feels like she has a wealth of time to work through her own hesitations and shyness and problems with facing how she feels. And then the world says, you're out of time. And she has to live with that forever, essentially.
Right, which is so heartbreaking. How did you go about getting into the mind of 2 young women in general, right?
Yeah.
But then during that time period, it's a added pressure.
Yeah, it is, and I'm interested in that kind of pressure, I'm interested in that kind of ambition. You know, for a while especially, there was such a fear of where a writer's authority came from that people, you know, like 10 years ago were saying pretty much, "You have to stay in your lane." And that seemed to me a little absurd when you realize we're writing fiction, and that fiction is all about the exercise of the empathetic imagination. And with my students, they would often say, "Oh, you know, I'm a little leery because 'cause I'm writing about someone from a different background," and I would say, "Well, where are you from?" And they would say, you know, "I'm from Williamsburg, Brooklyn," and I would say, "Well, where do you get off writing from someone who's from Brooklyn 4 blocks away, right? Where do you get off writing about your mother? Where do you get off writing about yourself 20 years ago?" I mean, all of these are in important ways acts of hubris, and as long as you acknowledge that, as long as you say, "I recognize that what I'm doing is very hubristic, and I need to be respectful of that. I need to be aware that I'm taking a giant
Right.
leap here." Then I think the reader is in the position, ideally, of saying either, "Okay, that leap worked. You persuaded me," or, "No, that leap didn't work. You need to work harder on that. That was slovenly, or that was lazy, or that didn't work for." But I don't think the reader really is in the position of saying, or should be in the position of saying, "You don't even have the option to do that." Right? You shouldn't even
Right.
try, right? And especially dispiriting to have readers saying that at a time when, you know, readership is collapsing and literary readership is collapsing. The idea that those of us who still care about literature would be fighting with each other over who gets to do what feels again like one of those circular firing squads that the left is so good at, and one of the reasons the right is always in ascendance, you know?
Right, yeah, and I think I forget who it was who said you can do anything as well as you do it. Yeah, as long as you do it well,
Long as you do it
you
well,
know?
right?
Yeah,
And so I'm often taking on things where I'm like, I'll get interested in it and I'll just start noodling around. And then at some point I'll go, wait, are you really going to do this? And a good example of that is years ago, I was working on a novel about Aeschylus, and I'd gotten into it without realizing how far in over my head I would be. And I was working on it for a few years and really struggling with it. And I was chatting with Ann Carson, who is
oh,
one
yeah.
of the
She
smartest people I've ever known, and Anne said, "So what are you working on?" And I said, "I'm working on a novel about Aeschylus." And she gave a short barking laugh, and you really don't want Anne Carson to give a short barking
Right.
laugh when you tell her what you're working on. So I said, you know, "Well, what's wrong with that?" And she said, "Oh, you can't do a novel about Aeschylus." And I said, "Oh, why not?" And she said, "'Cause I can't. If I can't, you can't." And and
Wow.
and part of what she meant was, you know, Aeschylus is himself an oblique place to classicists. She's a classicist, And
Hmm.
she freely admits that she doesn't understand Aeschylus and knows very, very little about him. I'm not even that, right? So, when you're trying to build a historical figure, you're trying to build it on the basis of information and inference. And with Aeschylus, we have almost no information. I think what the Oxford Classical Encyclopedia says about him is we know three things for sure, kind of thing. So you're essentially inventing everything, including at one point, apparently he was a devotee of something called the Eleusinian Mysteries. No one knows what the Eleusinian Mysteries were.
That gives
Um,
you a lot of leeway,
yeah,
right?
but it also means that, like, if I said to you, create an Irish writer named James Joyce. He was apparently a Catholic. That was really important to him. We don't know what Catholicism was. So invent Catholicism, essentially. And then, so I ended up, when I get despairing, I don't know about other writers, but when I get despairing, I find that it helps to get angry rather than depressed. And I ended up getting really angry with myself and saying something like, all right, well, just do some tiny little bit of Aeschylus. See if you can do that. And one of the few things we actually do know about Aeschylus, because he had it put on his epitaph, is that he fought at a marathon. He was proud of that.
Interesting.
And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to do Aeschylus at marathon, just that little sliver of his life. And even that was wildly hubristic, but it wasn't asking me to do all these other things that I was beginning to realize beyond my ken.
Right.
And even so, I'm sure a number of classicists looking at that, some would be persuaded by it. One of the things I do with my nonfiction is I also always run it by people who know more about these subjects than I do after I'm finished. Some would be persuaded by it. Some would be like, oh, you made obvious mistakes here and there. But really, remember, what we're trying to do is create a plausible illusion. We're
Hmm.
not trying to recreate the reality. And so if it works for a number of intelligent readers, then I'm happy. Right.
So, in terms of the two of them, with Constance and Minna, did you read a lot of literature of the time period? Did you read letters?
Yeah,
And
I
just
try to
see.
avoid fiction about the fiction I'm writing about because I don't
Hmm.
want to reinvent the wheel. What I always try to do is find primary sources. And happily, with pre-Edwardian England, there is a shit ton of primary sources of women's memoirs, women's diary, women's letters, there's just an endless stream of that stuff. And so you can really submerge yourself in voices from that period. And that's a wonderful way of feeling like you have the authority to start to ventriloquize because you start to get an education in how the sensibilities were similar and how they were different.
Hmm. So, and even the spelling, I noticed in the story, you use the spelling from the time period from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, with a magazine like the New Yorker, that's a struggle, right? Because they have a style set where they go, "This is the way we do it," and then you have to argue with them to say, "Well, this is actually the way she would have spelled it," that kind of thing. But
Right, right.
you're discovering language that helps you channel a whole sensibility. Like there's a word in there that I'd never seen before until I ran across it in a woman's letter, and that was at one point the close third person narrator says, and
Mm.
Constance swithered about it for a few days and then knew she would do it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and swithered is such a great pre-Edwardian English word.
It's wonderful, yeah. So it is close third person in Constance's mind, and I love the way that that allowed the structure to go back and forth in time, just as she was thinking about everything happening. The story opens with her early life, then she receives the job offer from her father. She meets Minna, and we get her first meeting with Minna. Then the story jumps to the chaos of the Lusitania sinking, and the story moves back in time slightly to explain how they came to be on the ship. We get the torpedo strike, and we go back in time with Constance. I won't walk through them all,
Right,
but we're
right.
going back and forth the whole time. But it's so close in her POV. And I guess I think that's something that like beginning writers or even intermediate writers struggle with. Is the reader going to follow me back
With
and
that
forth in
kind of
time? Like,
structural
yeah.
complexity.
How do you gain the confidence to do that? Or are you just following her mind at that point?
I'm not so much following her mind. I mean, one of the things that'll happen is you'll have a plan that seems to you certainly clever enough or workable enough. And if I'm doing a research heavy story, I have to lay out a kind of map for a plan because there's so much information to sort of marshal. But if I don't vary from that plan pretty quickly, it's usually a bad sign. Usually because you're teaching yourself as you're going along. And one of the plans I had for this was a much more linear traditional story where we get to know them, we get to see that there's some tension, we get to see that relationship is building, and then meanwhile, there's this thing looming in the distance, and that's this ship. And I always had a childish pleasure in those kinds of narratives that were like, we're going up the gangplank. What does that life preserver say? Does that say Lusitania? That kind of thing. And so that was the plan. And about 5 pages into it, I realized that plan already bores me. And in fact, why not evoke the abruptness with which the Lusitania's actual passengers discovered that their lives had been brutally disrupted, essentially? It also had the nice advantage of, Constance, and this relates to the close third person as well. Constance, on the one hand, is quite well aware of what her conflicts are, and on the other hand, doesn't really want to face them. And so events, really hyper dramatical events like that, break up her consciousness enough that she's sort of forced to go back and think about things. And she's also able to avoid things at some points, right? But structurally, the way the story operates is to align the trauma, the most dramatic traumas, traumatic parts of the sinking and the loss of Minna, to the traumatic parts that Constance was eliding in their relationship, which is her betrayal of Minna, and she's putting that off as long as she can possibly put it off, essentially. And I think the close third really works there to allow us to sometimes understand that Minna understands very, very clearly what she's avoiding, and to sometimes let her pretend that she's just being herself, just being a proper young lady.
Yeah, it was because we're in such a different time period now, it was hard to figure out how much each they were both realizing about their feelings,
Right.
or if they even would have a word for what was happening between them. Or I mean, I love the fact that they came up right against it and then they retreated, and that seemed so realistic to me.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the things I came across a lot in the letters and memoirs were women who could frankly say at that time, "Well, you're the love of my life. You're the most important person in my life. You're the person I feel the most intensely about." But that stopped well short of sexual activity for the most part. It might involve some kissing, it might involve some fondling, but usually it didn't go as far as sexual activity. I'm imagining Minna is rebellious enough that she registers that she might in fact be ready to have sexual activity with Constance. Constance won't let herself go that far, but she will acknowledge to herself, "You are the most important person in my life, and I will never feel romantically about any man the way I feel about you." But one of the really striking things about that historical moment that fascinated me was the way women were coming to terms with that, right? The most important romantic person I know is my friend who I get to see once a month at lunch, and I have a perfectly good marriage, nothing to complain about in my marriage. And of course, there was an enormous amount of longing. Of course, there was an enormous amount of lying to oneself in some ways. But there was also an acknowledgement, there was an open acknowledgement that this person is incredibly important to me. And part of what Minna is getting more and more frustrated about, of course, is that Constance claims she can make that acknowledgement and still won't act on it fully. And that seems to Minna both hypocritical and cowardly, I think.
so was that part of the reason that when Minna gets the job with Constance's father, for whatever reason, Constance is like, doesn't answer the door and doesn't want her to
Yeah.
come on the trip? She doesn't
Yeah,
want those
in fact,
2 to
that's one of those
overlap.
moments when what's the language in the story? She had surprised herself with her lack of enthusiasm for Minna's request, a lack she neither understood nor examined. And
Right.
that second part is what I mean by that, the way a character can sort of go, "Yeah, I'm not gonna go there." And I think we do that all the time. One of the things I would talk about with my students is the notion of the epiphany, that Joycean notion of the epiphany has made us all think, "Oh, so really what's going on in fiction and literary fiction is characters don't know something, and then they learn something, and then they're wiser and they don't make that mistake again." But clearly, that's those of us who have families register, that's not the way things work, right? You don't sort of say to yourself,
Yeah.
"Wow, now I understand how my mom drives me crazy. She'll never drive me crazy again," right? That just
Right.
doesn't
It
work
would
that
be
way.
great if it
Wouldn't
worked.
that be
Yeah.
great? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what happens is over and over again, we understand things and they might have an effect on us, but we keep on making the same mistakes. And I've been always fascinated with the paradox of characters who are emotionally quite self aware and still shoot themselves in the foot. And I think a
Right.
lot of literary readers fall into that category. In relative terms, I'm emotionally quite self aware. Why am I in this relationship? Or why can't I deal with this other thing? Why can't I have a normal conversation with my sister? Whatever, right?
Right.
So Constance registers when she's dismayed at Minna's request. She registers, well, that's surprising, right? I should want Minna around more,
Mhm.
but I'm not going to pursue that. And that leaves a little mystery for the reader, although I intend for the reader to sort of figure out at least that Constance is much more comfortable when things are compartmentalized. And it's not like she's terrified that Minna's gonna say to her father, "Your daughter might be a lesbian." But
Right.
it just makes her uneasy, the idea that her dad, who's the second most important person in her life, and Minna, who's the most important person, are just gonna be hanging out without her. That makes her uneasy, and so for that reason, all she's really doing is dragging her feet at first, and
Right.
then when Minna goes around her, because Minna is a decisive person, when Minna goes around her, that annoys her, and then she thinks, "Okay, well, now I'm not just gonna drag my feet, now I'm gonna actively sabotage this if I can," essentially.
Yeah, it seems like Minna has I mean, they're both fairly courageous for the time period. I mean, at least Constance, she's always true to herself, and
Right.
she's mad Connie and she's walking through the woods alone. But I think she always seems to be more regretful that she's not more, I mean, quote unquote, normal.
Yeah.
She seems to be wishing that she was more a part of things.
Yeah, and
But
it's not
Minna
just
seems to be happy with herself.
Minna is much more happy being an
Yeah.
outlier, essentially, and Minna is also much more willing to upset people. It's not just that Constance is more of a conformist, she's also what would have been considered then a good girl or
Right.
a lady, a good woman. There's that moment where one of the suffragettes throws herself in front of the
Yes.
the horses, and she's staggered by the rebelliousness of that, and then she's very, very moved by the women who come out and do this enormous the suffragettes who come out and do this enormous funeral, but she's also stunned that her father is so horrified by it.
I
And her and
totally
her
noted that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and her father is such a powerful authority in her life that she thinks, "Well, I don't know what to make of this," right? On the one hand, I hugely admire that woman. On the other hand, I'm mortified that she upset my father and upset so many people, you know?
exactly. Because her mother was so cold toward her,
Yeah.
and, if she loses her father, that's kind of her
That's
most
everything.
important yeah, that's everything.
Yeah.
So, while Minna talks about her spirit of mutiny and Constance calls her the queen of bad influences, but I wondered a lot about what life would have been like, if Minna had lived. It didn't seem like it would have worked out between them because they were already having conf I mean, it's so funny, it's true all the time that there are people who talk a lot about being, a part of the rebellion or the resistance or whatever, but they can't they're more conformists, they value getting along with people more than they value whatever cause it is, and it
Yeah.
seems like that's the way Constance is, and Minna's gonna do something completely different.
Yeah, I think that's right, and probably, and I also think that Constance, remember, is driven mostly by loneliness and by a sense that she's come to terms with her own lack of hope, right? She's decided, well, I'm one of those people who's just never going to be close to anybody, and that's fine. I'll get by. I got by my shyness. That I can actually have friendly conversations with people. Then she meets Minna, and it's like I didn't even know anything like this was possible. But both Minna and she register what sort of ceiling lies above them, right? Neither of them is rebellious enough that they're going to suggest going off to the South Seas and living in a grass hut naked.
Right,
What they say to each other at the height of their intimacy is, "So what do you think? Do you think we'll stay close when we're married to other people?" Um,
right.
and I think that's what they both envision. Minna
Mm,
might think, "Well, I might not ever marry anybody because I'm fine having just somebody like Constance." Constance,
right.
even though she jokes about, "Well, I'll never get married," Constance obviously assumes she'll get married or get married to somebody that her father chose. And Minna knows her well enough to say exactly that. You'll marry somebody your father approves of. And that's where, when we jump to that in the story, there's both this sense of, oh, the sadness of, oh, Minna knew her better than she knew herself, and the sadness of all of this that she claimed wouldn't work out, worked out exactly the way she might have feared or thought it would, right?
Exactly.
But that
Yeah.
marriage to that boy is much less pleasurable if there's no Minna in the world to have this intimacy with, you know?
Right, and he's not even named, he's just a nice guy that
Just a nice guy.
yeah, he just fits the profile. Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to yeah, can you okay, Jennifer says, "Can you talk about the 2 images in Constance's mind at the end of the story?"
Yeah, I sure could, Jennifer. When you get to a point like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the story, I don't know about you, but I don't always have an ending planned. I certainly didn't have an ending planned in this case. I knew things weren't going to work out between Minna and Constance, and I knew Constance was going to beat herself up about that. But I didn't know exactly how the story was going to end. But this is a really good example, I think, of one of the advantages of doing research because you really can let the world teach you. There's a wonderful story about Emile Zola in which he was writing his novel about French miners called Germinal. And he thought, well, I better go down into the mines and learn something about these people. And he went down into the mines and he saw a Percheron, one of those enormous horses, pulling a load of coal through a tunnel that was inches bigger than the Percheron itself. The Percheron could just barely fit through the tunnel. And Zola said to the miners, "How do you get that horse down here every morning?" And they all laughed at him. And he said, "What are you laughing at?" And they said, "Mr. Zola, that horse doesn't come down here every day. That horse comes down here when he's a foal, and he grows up down here, and he loses his sight down here, and he pulls coal down here every moment of his waking life until he dies down here, and then we bury him down here." And Zola thought, "Oh my God, talk about a metaphor." In this case, I'm piling up details when I'm doing research, and I pile up a detail like, small groups of women who were unwilling to jump, even though it was, 5, 6, 7 feet, because they were ladies and because it was scary and because they were like, well, certainly the world's going to come take care of me, right? And you just write that down as a little detail because it seems viscerally important. And then you're writing a story like this, and suddenly you go, "Oh my God," right? That's that's literally what's happening, right? Or the other detail, because I wanted it to be not only anxiety, but also selfishness. The other detail is the woman and her baby sliding on the deck and everybody just stepping out of their way rather than intercepting them. And those are both details from eyewitness accounts at the Lusitania, but they're details that I marked down and stored without knowing why I was storing them. They just seemed like useful details. And then you get to a point in the where you taught yourself enough about the story that you think, "Oh, this is actually something I can deploy where I didn't expect to deploy it," essentially.
Yeah, it was amazing. Just the images were perfect at the
No, I'm
end
glad.
for everything. Yeah. Okay, well, I wanted to ask you about some of the images in the story. So the gorse, how did you come up with the gorse in the beginning and then later on?
That's another great example of how you teach yourself as you go, because somewhere along the line, I came across a young woman who said she used to love the way the gorse made her hands smell. And she tried to find a language for it and couldn't quite. And I came across somewhere else a detail about a mother who was always angry with her daughter for seeming to be sniffing her hands. And so I put those two things together, right? And then I'm moving towards I wanted one final really happy memory with Minna before the unhappy memory. And I thought, oh, of course, the gorse, essentially. And the gorse at that point, for the reader, is starting to represent there's this wonderful thing that I don't even know why I like it, but society has always told me I can't like it, right? Why are you smelling your hand? Stop smelling your hand, right? And it's such a simple childlike thing to do. And it's exactly the way society comes down on somebody for really no reason whatsoever, just because, well, you don't want your daughter sniffing her hand and looking odd, right? But meanwhile, the daughter's like, "What's wrong with smelling my hand? I like the way my hand smells," you know? And so
Yeah.
that stood in a small little way for Minna, essentially.
Yeah, for all of Constance's restrictions,
Right.
basically. Okay, so Minna gives this business advice, and this I don't know why, I just kept thinking about it. State what you want. Well, state what you want, why you want it, and how you propose to get it. And I just thought that was so odd and refreshing, and I was curious about how that came into the story.
I was a little worried about that because it sounds almost like business self-help from the 20th
Right.
century, 20th century.
Yeah,
But I was relieved when I came across a version of it again in somebody's letters, and so I thought, "Okay, so they thought that straightforwardly back then as well." But what I liked about it in terms of the way it operates in the story is in its bluntness, it's clearly intended to be a way for a young woman, especially a young woman in pre-Edwardian England, to find a way of negotiating a man's world. You've gotta be straightforward. You can't rely on them to hand things to you. But it works so perfectly for Minna's impatience with Constance's emotional life, right? State what you want and how you intend to get it. And that's a good example, I think, also in the way that in terms of how structure works. Constance brings that up at the very last minute. And the reason she's bringing it up at the very last minute, I think, is because she knew exactly what Minna meant when Minna told her that, and she pretended she didn't. And so it's only at the very, very last minute, and when she's at feeling the height of guilty, when she lets it back into her consciousness and goes, Minna always meant for me to understand this, and part of the betrayal with Minna is not just I think if you imagine yourself as Minna, it's not just, "Oh, I was hoping you'd be more courageous than you are." It's also, "You're pretending you don't understand me, and we're supposed to be intimate, right? I would much prefer you be straightforward with me and say you're frightened than pretending." And so that like that first argument they have, it's almost entirely oblique, right? Where it's like, "I don't even know what you're talking about." "Well, I don't know what you're talking about either." And it's one of those moments when they do know what they're talking about, but neither one of them, they're both stubborn enough that they're gonna go, "Well, if you're not gonna say it, I'm not gonna say it." Right?
right, because
Um,
everything will change once they say it.
yeah, everything
They
will
just can't
change.
go there. Right,
And also, I'm just tentatively feeling this out, and you're not brave enough to do it. Okay, well then forget it. We won't do it for right now, right? If you don't want to
yeah,
do it, you don't have to. You get that petulance when you feel like you're doing all the work in a relationship, and
mhm.
I think they each feel that.
When you were writing the story, I was noticing, like, the first 3 well, of my printed out story, the first 3 pages of it is 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 all about Constance's childhood, and, the convention is now, get into the story, start in the middle, but you did a lot of backdrop on her, and I
Yeah,
guess I was wondering how you came to the conclusion that you needed that much. I felt like you did definitely need that much so that we understood her situation completely, but
it's an interesting juxtaposition with what we were talking about before in terms of getting to the Lusitania so fast.
Mhm.
Because I think if I had ended up with that linear structure where the Lusitania is at the very end, I would have gone back and said, "This is way too much backstory. This is taking too long to get things going." And I think
Right.
as a reader, when you first encounter the story, you get all of those pages of childhood and the shyness, and finally we're meeting Minna. And I think you think, "Wow, this story is moving very slowly." I'm not unhappy with it necessarily, but it's not flying along by any means. And so that makes the dunking in the water all the more shocking because it's as though we weren't trying to be economical at all, and suddenly it's hyper economical. And so
Yeah.
I like the way the 2 work together essentially.
Yeah.
And
Was
again, I
that
think
just
it also evoked that what I was talking about before about the way Constance if you come from a life like Constance's, you think, "I have all the time in the world." In fact, that's part of the problem, right? What am I gonna
Mhm.
fill my days with? And so that's sort of what's being evoked in the early going. And then it's like, "No, you don't have any time at all."
So was that just instinct with you, or did that come along in a later draft where you just thought, "I'm gonna insert the Lusitania here"? Do you go by instinct, or how does that work?
I think the way it works is I go by what I hope is a coherent, rational plan. And then, as I was saying before, my instincts start to show me as I'm moving into the
That you're
story
getting
where
by.
the plan's shortcomings are. I mean, a lot of the
Got it.
plan stays in place, but as I said before, if I don't start to see serious shortcomings, I know there's a problem with my gathering understanding because I should
Mhm.
be, as I'm teaching myself more and more about Constance and Minna and how they relate, I should be seeing what was inadequate about my plan because when I made my plan, I didn't know them as well.
Right.
You actually educate it's not I don't it's not a matter of now that I understand these characters with such godlike wisdom, now I can go back and tell you about it. It's much more I learn about them by miming my way through their story, essentially, and that
Right.
makes me go back and change the shape because I realize now the shape was inadequate.
Interesting. Yeah, because I think when you're first starting out writing, you might be going along, you don't know them that well, and then you lose faith in the story
Yeah.
before you allow yourself to get to know them. So I think that will help a lot of people to know that you don't know, and you just
Yeah.
keep going, and then you go back.
Yeah, it is really an act of faith. It's like walking into a dark room. And in
Mhm.
fact, I always loved E.L. Doctorow had a great metaphor for writing fiction. He was talking about novel writing, but it's true of short stories too. He said, writing a novel is like driving at night. He goes, you can only see as far as your headlights, but you can go all the way to California like that.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like
Such
you
a great
only
line.
can see 100 yards or 50 yards, but once you go those 50 yards, you can see another 50 yards, you know? And that's really helpful because what paralyzes a lot of writers, I think, is the understanding. It's not they're not fooling themselves. It's the understanding that they don't know these people in that world that well. Even if they're writing autobiographically, they don't know it well enough. And
Yeah.
so you just freeze up. You're like, "Oh my god, how am I gonna learn?" And I think what you forget is that the way you're gonna learn is by doing it. You're not
Right.
gonna learn by sitting there and just musing, that's not gonna be very helpful.
Sometimes do you just put it away for a while if you get to an impasse or you feel like you don't know, say, the ending? Did you get that image right away, or maybe did you have to put it away for a
I had
while?
to put it away for a little while, but I'm also the way my mind is working when I'm writing, as I'm heading towards the ending in a draft, I'm starting to propose and counter propose ideas and just I'm like so when I finish writing and maybe I'm 5 pages from the end or 10 pages from the end, as I'm leaving the desk, I'm sort of thinking, "Well, I could do that, I could do this, what about this, what about that?" And almost none of them work. And then you just say to yourself, "That's all right, relax, you did enough for today, you did a little bit," you know? That
It'll
that
come.
that willingness to be easier on yourself and to say to yourself, "It's okay, what you did for today is okay," is really, really important. I've had days one of the things I do when I go back to a work is go over what I did the day before I move forward, right? Revise before I move forward. And I've had days when I spent the entire day just revising the little bit I wrote before I moved forward. And it feels despairing, right? Because you didn't move forward at all. You just went over the mess you made yesterday. But then I try to say to myself, but you made that better. That's not as bad as it was before, right?
Yeah. Yeah, just having a little self-compassion along the way. I was trying to remember, we were sitting here, and I have it here somewhere, but the king that you mentioned, someone the great.
Alfred the Great.
Yes, I just wondered what his role in the story was, because when I looked him up and I have all these notes about him, it seemed like he was not a bad guy, but I mean, in terms of wanting education, but there must have been something I missed. I mean, it was just like a little Wikipedia thing, so
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these times you'll choose something for one or two reasons, and you won't worry about the giant other constellation of associations that come with them. But in this case, it's a little satiric moment where none of the boys at these dances are interested in her except one boy who claims that he's not a modern Brit at all. He's somebody more like
yes.
Alfred the Great, who's, one of the lionized early kings of England. But it's not so much what Alfred represents as much as what the evocation of what a boy who would say that to you at a dance, how that would make you roll your
Okay.
eyes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it also allows you'll notice because it's close third person, Constance is not gonna say, "And by the way, it's 1915," right? But it allows Constance to say to him, "Hey, hey, this is not 886, this is 1915," and the reader can go, "Oh, now I'm a little bit more oriented as well." But there are references like that that are supposed to be both indications of a shared culture, right? We all recognize Alfred the Great. We all know that we're part of the reason we're staying in line, part of the reason we're following these conformist ideas is that we believe in what England was as an idea. So we're all agreed Alfred the Great was a great king. On the other hand, I'm rebellious enough that if a boy says to me, "I feel more like Alfred the Great," I think, "Yeah, I think we're finished here, you and me. I don't need to date you anymore," that kind of
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we never get a real picture of what Constance looks like at all, which I actually really appreciated, except through the fact that she except through the fact that she's, sitting out so many dances. So there's something either about her the way she's presenting is extremely shy or possibly not the most attractive person in the
Right.
room. I love that that was left open-ended because it seems like a lot of the time what you're capable of, especially these 2 characters, depends on your attitude and what you're willing to go after.
Yeah,
And
I think that's
definitely in
really
those
true.
yeah, in this dance, she's not willing to she doesn't flirt, so she doesn't even try.
Yeah, I think we'd have to say, given the evidence, that she can't be a stunning beauty, right? Or people would be hunting her down even though she was shy. I didn't
Right.
imagine her as horribly plain either. I imagined her as, perfectly attractive in a kind of a normal way, not particularly pretty. She says about Minna, the only description you get about Minna is when she first sees her, she's a striking young woman. And
Yes.
and that is carefully chosen too, because it's like very close to romantic/sexual, but not exactly there, right?
Mhm.
And one of the things that I do with my students is I give them an exercise called narrative modes, where I say you have to create the same character in just action, in just dialogue, in just exposition, or in just description. And one of the
Wow.
things that teaches them instantly is what they're more comfortable with,
Mm,
what they really feel, I can't do this, and what they're like, I love doing this. And
mm.
when I give myself that exercise, it turns out I'm much less comfortable with a straight description than other people are. So I'm trying to take what's normally a drawback, which is I don't feel comfortable doing description, and turn it into a virtue. And I know writers who
Mhm.
are spectacularly good at description. You can think of a lot of them yourself, right? Virginia Woolf,
Right,
Henry James, Vladimir Nabokov can take 15 minutes to describe Kelly's face, and you just feel like, my God, I can really see Kelly. And then
right.
there are other writers like Ernest Hemingway who almost never describe anybody except maybe one detail or something like that.
Mhm.
And so in this case, because I'm not comfortable with description, I tend to avoid it anyway. But then I think, well, how can I turn that into something that works for the story, essentially?
Yeah, I love that because a lot of what I've heard from talking to other writers is that they'll realize that they have a shortcoming in one, say, scene setting. They're just writing dialogue and the dialogue is appearing as if it's in the people are floating in midair, but
Right.
they're really, really good at dialogue and then they have to go back and set the scene. But I like the way that you can modulate that a little
Yeah.
bit. I'm not as good at that possibly because I don't need that as much in my stories.
Yeah. And also it's just very useful as a writer to know what your toolbox consists of, right? To know
Right.
this is what I go to as a fallback thing. I'm always comfortable in this mode. I'm never comfortable in this mode. And sometimes you say to yourself, well, whether you're comfortable or not, you have to do it here, right? You got to
Right.
do something, right?
Yeah, we need
Yep.
to know where they're standing or
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Exactly.
yeah. I have another question from Jennifer.
All right.
Following on the discussion of the king, I love how you integrated details that illustrate color the specificity of the historic moment, like tilted high above the ship's Marconi wires. I love that too. That was fantastic. So the
Oh,
Marconi wires, I guess that was part of the research, but
yeah, I
it's
mean, when you read as everything about how the Lusitania went down, you just have an endless series of wonderful details, right? And yeah, really, the what happens as a fiction writer doing research that you'd have to be alert to is because you're doing all this hard work, and because there's so many wonderful details, you just want to save them all. You want to put them all in because you're like, oh my God, this is so great. And one of the things you have to understand is that a lot of them are doing the same emotional work, and they're all doing more or less emotional work. So it's usually the case that you're losing a gigantic percentage of those details before you even do as you're doing a draft, but then even more as you're going over your draft. And so you're looking for those details that make the reader go, oh, that feels like something that only somebody there would have known, right? And the Marconi wires is a really good example of that. Another example of that is if you're thinking, okay, what's it like to be on a ship that's listing that much? If you read eyewitness accounts, you have a 500 details about what it's like to be and then you find one like if the cash registers are all slung open, right? And you think that's perfect. right? That tells me so much about what it would be like to be on that ship at that moment. And so that means when you find that you lose some of the other ones, right? And you might even have written down the mother and the baby sliding across the deck because you were thinking, well, this would be a good way of describing the list, right? That's how much the ship was tilted. Mothers and babies were sliding. And then you think, no, the cash register is better for that. Turns out the mother and the baby can be used for something else.
Yeah, and the mother and the baby is so dramatic, and but the cash register, because it's such a small detail, it's such a thing that you would catch out of the corner of your eye, it seems, s mo far more realistic
Yeah, I
a
think
little
that's
bit.
right. And also,
Yeah,
if you're building in emotional terms and you're going back over this story, you don't wanna have the mother and daughter sliding and then the cash register, right? You wanna go from
right,
cash register to baby, not baby to cash register.
and I suppose you read a lot of details about how people were floating in the water and the children were
Absolutely. And in fact,
crying.
that's one of the surprising things about the Lusitania for people that's only obliquely registered in the story, but it's registered, and that is a huge number of children died. And the reason a huge number of children died was because everybody was worried about the submarine warfare. And the assumption was that the safest place was on a giant ocean liner, both because why would the Germans torpedo a giant ocean liner? And if they did, they couldn't sink it. And so all of these nervous parents had piled their children onto the Lusitania. And so a huge number of the victims were children.
That's horrible. Well, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask so you have a new short story collection coming out and the title story
This one, it's
is this
called.
one? And are they all historical fiction or are
A
they
lot of them are because, like many of us, if I can get out of 2026 America and go somewhere else psychically, I'll try to do it. But also because, again, I'm always trying to turn myself into a more interesting human being. So and a lot of them are involve disaster. There's a story about the Johnstown flood. There's a
Mhm.
story about the Labor Day hurricane in Florida that was such a disaster. There's a story about the biggest wildfire in American history. But there's
Wow.
also some much more autobiographical stories, like there's a story about the institutionalization of my older brother. So it's not
Mm.
just historical stuff.
So how long did this book take you to write with all of that research going?
Probably a book like this would take me 4 or 5 years of accumulating stories.
Okay.
But a novel of mine, Phase 6, about a
Mhm.
pandemic before the pandemic came out, was published in 2020, and I already had a
Oh,
few of
good
these.
timing.
Yeah, exactly. About as bad as it gets, really. I already had a couple of the stories written by then, so the stories just sort of accumulate over time.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, and thanks, Jennifer, for all the great questions, and I really
Kelly, thank
enjoyed
you for being
this.
such a good host.
Yeah, it was, I mean, such a thrill for me, so thank you so much.